Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. Um, my name's Sky, my pronouns are he, him, and I really wanted to be a part of this podcast as a trans man because I'm really passionate about intersectionality. I admire both of you a whole lot. And I think we should get started. What is Women's History Month? Why is it important, and what does it why does it matter?
I will just say that I have to be honest that I still have some trouble with reconciling Women's History Month in the spirit of feminism and my own awareness of the exclusionary practices of feminism. And so it's like I almost get a little like heart palpitation because I know the spirit in which it began and in which that was a way to give voice to something that had been silenced. And like every social movement, it came out of a certain time and in a certain place. And some of those issues we have a different perspective on now. And although I, as a young feminist and a young lesbian, kind of in the late 1980s, really identified with something like a women's movement. Um, the same feminist queer theorist part of me also now has trouble aligning with something that specifies on the basis of gender a certain group of people. And so I understand that there's a difference between what the intention was and how I experience it now. And it is one of those interpersonal struggles to be like, yes, yeah, yeah, totally get it, totally get it, totally get it. I'm in a slightly different place now. And that's a part of, I guess that's a part of social progress. But so I have this like excited ambivalence and hope for the future.
Are you speaking about just to clarify for our listeners and for myself? You're speaking about the trans exclusionary feminist movement, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think
And
it's yeah.
and just white feminism and middle
Yeah.
class feminism and
Yep.
Americanism and that. So
Yeah.
there's actually a lot of dimensions of
Oh,
exclusion
100%.
and so I understand that, how I understood like the way in which it was speaking truth to power. I still understand that. That was a part of my introduction to social justice politics.
Mhm.
Now, with a little more history, looking back on it, I'm like, wow, okay. Yeah, there's a lot of social movements that move ahead by setting aside certain issues. The civil rights movement said women. I'm not sure about that. The women's movement is like, oh, racism, LGBTQ, gender. Wait, what? And so this is something that has happened in the history of all social justice movements. So I can get that, and I can,
Mhm.
but I still am like, oh. So it's
We
just
can do better.
we can do
Yeah.
better, and it's also trying to be accountable as an activist. That
Mhm.
maybe what seduced me into my activism was I wasn't ready yet to tear down those deeper structures. Maybe I
Mhm.
had to start small and reach a point now where I can be like, well, that was problematic. And that's a little shameful for me to sort of think about for myself. Like, did I really need to make it so easy? Yeah. Yeah. These are the things you think about when you're an activist and you're a lesbian and you're a queer and you're 50. You think, what have I done?
Sky, we've talked about this a ton of times in all of the classes we've taken together, but it really comes down to representation, right? When we think
Mhm.
about the vital role of women in American history, there always tends to be too much of a focus on one particular body of women or one particular gender identity or sexuality at the exclusion of others. And we might talk about this a little later. But I remember being in my first women's and gender studies class in undergrad. It was a
Mhm.
feminist philosophy course. And we had 1 week in that course dedicated to feminist women of color. And we read one reading by Bell Hooks and one reading by Gloria Anzaldua. And as a Latina or a Mexican American woman myself, and as someone who identifies as pansexual when that word wasn't even really a thing back in the day, I
Mhm.
remember reading Gloria Anzaldua's work and thinking, where has she been my entire life, right? A queer, brown, feminist philosopher and theorist from Texas. but yet we only get one day to focus on women of color or queer women in an entire semester. And I mean, granted, we've come a long way, right? But I always think about which voices and which stories are spotlighted and heard at the expense of others. And I thought it would be interesting for us to think about this too, as I was researching like different discourses or dialogues that we have currently on Women's History Month. And the National Women's History Alliance designates a yearly theme for Women's History Month. And the theme this year is Women Providing Healing and Promoting Hope. And I thought that was particularly poignant here, particularly in the midst of anti transgender legislation that we're seeing across the country, especially in my home state of Texas, and thinking about the way in which COVID-19 has radicalized all of our embodied experiences. So when we think about women's contributions to our country and the contributions we know about and the ones we don't know about, right? If we're thinking about providing healing and promoting hope, we can also think about where we can go from here, maybe in that like line of thinking.
Yeah, I think it's important to pay homage to the past, but also amplify different voices so that we can all learn from each other. Um, Shameless plug, we're doing a media representation panel this week with Leah actually at Provo Encircle. Not sure if you guys are going to hear this by then, but if you want to check it out, I think it'll be online. Um, love, I actually facilitate the Q BIPOC Friendship Circle support group at Encircle, which is something I'm really proud of. Also, just like in general, like I think there's so much to learn from each other, that we can learn from each other, not just as women, as people. Do you know what I mean? Like we don't have to block out one person's contributions to make room for the rest of them. So I think that's something we should definitely keep in mind as a society moving forward. What moving on, who's a queer person? Sorry, I'm like stuttering here, but who is a queer person from women's history that everyone should know about? Who do you guys think?
Audra Lorde.
I actually don't know who that is. I feel bad, but
Oh, it's okay. Then I feel even better. You know, I talk about her all the time to my undergrads because I realize that this is one of those things. Our history does get lost. And I don't blame anyone for, because every year there's more, right? The amount of queer history that I had to internalize at 20 was much less than what you have to read. So there's a lot. It's like Google. There's like the queer, there should be like,
and they don't usually cover it in public schools, even if you come from a liberal, quote unquote, liberal state like California, where I came from. We learned about Harvey Milk. Like
I was about to say Harvey Milk,
and that was it. Not even. I'm from Southern California, so we like basically touched, like he was mentioned in our textbook, and that was it.
So we're in Southern California because I'm from the Los Feliz area of Hollywood.
Oh, cool. I'm from like West LA, near Century City.
Grow up next to each other. So anyway, Audra Lorde was a Black lesbian cancer survivor, feminist activist, and she, in many ways, before Kimberly Crenshaw began to talk about it academically, she was giving voice through her poetry and through her writing. She was giving voice to what we now call intersectionality, and which at the time we were trying to find a way to understand how different stigmas don't just add, they explode in a way that creates a new phenomenon. And she had a way of articulating that was amazing. And she's also very well known for a phrase that I literally was just talking to my students about 3 weeks ago. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In other words, whatever strategies, practices you have learned, and I filter this through academia, the privileges, the practices that I have inherited that are from the master, they're from the white supremacist. Okay, and maybe I've stayed in that system and I have gained the amount of power and privilege that's it's willing to dole out if you follow the rules. And then I like to tell myself that I'm going to use those tools against the master, against the system that has oppressed all of my brothers and sisters. And that is certainly, I mean, I've committed to that goal. I'm still planning to do that.
I think it's a
Audra
noble
Lorde,
intention, yeah.
Audra Lorde reminds us, be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful about what you're doing. Is it possible that there is no way that you can inherit those tools, use them, and not end up reproducing some of those failures? Is it possible? Yeah. And I don't have a yes or no answer to that, but that question rings in my head like a bell. And I always try to question, you know, what are the limitations of the master's tools?
Mm-hmm.
And what am I doing and what do I think I'm doing? And that has stayed with me forever.
Yeah, I think to go along with what you said, I think it's easy to say that we're going to protest peacefully like MLK did, but before he passed away, for example, in the civil rights movement, he acknowledged that the reason they made so much progress was because of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and in terms of Stonewall too, like we built this movement, these rights on the backs of queer BIPOC people, especially trans women, and we don't pay homage to that a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note that in order to create a new system, you got to break the wheel. Sometimes you got to set fire to it. Do you know what I mean? Like you can't just expect that you're going to go in there and sing kumbaya and everything's going to work out, you know? Sometimes you do have to break the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something we should draw attention to as social justice activists and as people in general.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. Yeah, Audra Lorde is a powerhouse. So for those of you who want to Google her, her first name is spelled Audre. Look her up, love her work, and hopefully she'll be as meaningful for you all as she has been for both Lisa and myself. Probably unsurprisingly, my queer person from women's history that everyone should know about is Gloria Anzaldua. And for me, when I was younger, I discovered Audra Lorde around the same time I discovered Gloria Anzaldua, and the queerness and the intersectionality from both of them, even though I didn't have those words when I was younger, right, helped make my younger years much more bearable. So Gloria Anzaldua is a Chicana feminist. She's a queer feminist, philosopher. She's a writer. She's an artist. She's incredible. She was born and raised in Texas at the U.S.-Mexico border in the literal borderlands, which is near and dear to my heart because I'm also from Texas. I was born and raised in Houston, but my family is from the border as well. And she wrote so much about identity and like nepantla and liminality, or rather concepts that help us understand the constantly shifting nature of our existence, right? So when we think about borders, it doesn't just have to be a physical border in between cities or states. We can think about borders that we face as queer individuals in Utah or in our home states, in our schools, in our families, constantly trying to navigate relationships as we navigate our own identities, right? And I remember when I first read her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, it's a mixture of a little bit of academic writing, but there's also artwork and prose and poetry. And if you identify as Latina or X or E, Gloria Anzaldua could potentially speak to you in really powerful ways. But even if you don't identify that way ethnically, you might still find some connections with Gloria Anzaldua, particularly as she talks about her body, her failing health, and really a lot of topics that we can relate to nowadays as well. She's been super foundational for me in many ways.
And I especially appreciate your comments about the work that she's done about the borders of the body, which is where I find her work like almost ahead of its time. It's very prescient when, you know, now the work that we're now doing about gender diversity and the experience of being in your body and around, and what are those borders, and inside and outside, the mind and the spirit. It's all about borderlands, and it's all about where you feel home. And you read her writing now, and it's like, oh my God, she was given to us early as a beacon. Hey, hey, pay attention to this. And it's amazing. That's really the mark of an artist that endures, is that now we read it, we see even more as culture and social justice gives us more borders to think about. She was right all along.
Yeah, she was a huge revolutionary, right? I mean, she died in the early 2000s of complications from diabetes, and she was young. And those of us who are activists and organizers and in the academy, all of us, I think, share that emotional labor and the love that we give and we experience when we literally put our bodies on the lines for topics and communities we're passionate about, right? So, to Lisa's point about how she was given to us and then taken too soon, unfortunately, like I think about how Gloria Anzaldua wrote in English, Spanish, and Spanglish when presses in the 1970s were like, you are not allowed to do that. And guess what? She did it anyways. And she pushed back on patriarchal, misogynistic cultural norms that told her she was less than because she was a lesbian, right? Because she privileged her partnerships both intimately and romantically with women above others. Like what she was doing during that time frame, so ahead of its time. And it's still so relevant even now that we're in the 2020s. You know, Sky, I don't know if you remember when we talked about this in media ethics, and it was specifically the chapter on art and entertainment, right? And I remember there were a lot of conversations going on that week about some of our own favorite musicians, right? Going back to Lisa's point as well. And some of y'all know that I'm really into like punk, pop punk, metal, and hardcore music, which has a really cool, like, countercultural, subcultural, like down with the man ethos at the same time that it has a problematic history with racism and sexism and violence and everything else. And I remember several years ago finding out about how some of the lead singers of my favorite bands were allegations started coming out about how they had assaulted women in the past several years. And all of the conversation circled around that one particular question. Just because the lead singer might have done XYZ, does that mean we have to throw out the entire band, especially when the band meant so much for so many individuals from a trauma survival perspective.
Other marginalized groups.
Exactly. Right. And that's just what came to mind when I was thinking about this, because, you know, how do we reconcile what these bands or performers or artists might have meant to us at one time and might still now, relatively compared with what they did or allegations that have come out against them about what they might have done. Right. It's a sticky subject for sure.
You know, every time I feel like I have this conversation with myself over and over again, and I have to keep reminding myself. You know, I almost feel like every time I spend some time thinking about exactly this, like, oh my God, your heroes are, this form of oppression doesn't mean that you are empathic over here. Like, these are complex things that all exist. That every time I spend even 10 minutes thinking about that, I know that that's what the man actually wants. It's for me to spend that 10 minutes in self conflict instead of realizing that they are laughing. Every time oppressed groups struggle with trying to work this out, that horizontal judgment, that horizontal oppression saps our energy, and that really what I'm striving toward, being oppressed on one dimension, has absolutely no effect on your ability to find whatever system of power you're trying to call it out and call it out. And that you can do that and you don't lose legitimacy. Thank you, J.K. Rowling, for those books. I am going to read those books and I am going to bring up your transphobia each and every time I talk about you. I don't have to choose. I can have it all. I can talk about you and love that. And that does not deprive me of the responsibility to say, And here's what else is going on in this situation. We don't have to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Who told us we had to choose? They did.
A bunch of white patriarchal figures, basically. Yeah.
Both
But yeah,
and.
both and I agree. Also, I just wanted to, as queer people of just queer people in general, do you guys I was wondering, and women especially, do you feel that I often feel, let me start with this. I often feel as though I am the representative for the trans community, not just in my academic life, but in my personal life, because people like come up to me and like ask me random questions and stuff, and I know that it probably happens to everyone who makes themselves visible. Do you think that visibility comes at a cost that's too high, or knowing that having positive experiences with groups that you disagree with helps change people's ethos about marginalized groups? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you think that we have to put ourselves on the line continuously to create effective and long-term change, or is there another way?
Oh, it's a hard one.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's many ways. And I think one of the things that I wish I had known when I was younger is that this is not a all or nothing decision.
Mm-hmm.
That you can actually change your mind at any time. How much you're willing, how much of yourself you're willing to give to representation, and how much of a boundary you need to draw around yourself for self-care. And that a decision that you make at one time in your life when you might be more vulnerable, professionally, personally, that you can change your mind. You know, there are times in my life where I felt it was so important to be like representing
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, it becomes exhausting. And so it's okay to say to yourself, okay, hey, the next couple of years, I've got a lot going on. Like my boundaries come first, me comes first.
I
And
feel
that,
like for women it's harder though, because you're expected to be nice and put on a smile. Do you know what I mean? Because of gender roles and stuff. I think it's absolute bullcrap. But like, people like expect women to be nice all the time, and that makes me mad. And I'm not even a woman. You know? Like, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I mean, you're exactly right. In fact, we know there's actually good data suggesting that, and the reason I know this is good is it affects people like me. College professors who are women um, uh, often get down rated for not being warm enough. And yet
Unrate my professor.
male professors are never expected to be warm. If you're a woman and you don't
Yeah.
smile enough, they're like, she wasn't maternal. You know, she didn't make me feel like she was my mommy. That stuff definitely happens. And so I think there now I try to just view it as strategic. I have a certain amount of energy that I'm willing to devote to maybe keeping my emotions in check for the good of the cause.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I've got a certain amount of points that I can spend on that per week, per month, whatever. And I'm willing to do it. I believe in the
Mm-hmm.
cause. I've seen change. I've seen that sometimes strategically, that's good strategy. But I know where to stop and where to say, I've had it. You know,
Mm-hmm. You have good boundaries
it took me a
with
while to figure
yourself.
that out.
Yeah.
It maybe took me like 20 years to figure that out, that I was no good to anybody if I felt that I was selling out. Wasn't good to
Mm-hmm.
anybody. So you
Yeah.
gotta ask yourself, what's too much?
And those
Go.
boundaries are everything. I kind of hit my breaking point in the last few months and was having a lot of honest conversations, not just with myself and my partner and my family, but going back to myself, right? A lot of honest conversations with myself about
Yeah.
how much time we have in one day, 1 week, 1 month. Where do I want that time to go? Like to your point about representation, Sky, and like what's too much, right? Where's the line?
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, I'm the first woman of color on the tenure track in the Department of Communication at our institution, as far as I know, right?
Cool.
And also being the only queer person that I'm aware of, with that kind of double visibility comes the labor of love of mentoring extra students, which we do because we love y'all. That's where our value and our joy and our meaning comes from. But then it also brings with it extra requests from the department and the institution, and
that the extra time, you give to people,
tell
they
us
don't
why we
know.
should respect people's pronouns, all this stuff. You become the token queer person. Yeah.
You know what's interesting? Here's a potential model to solve that, because I think you're right. We all experience that. So I have two friends who are at the university, and it's a cis female pan married to a trans man, and the trans man had their baby. And of course, a lot of their family had a lot of questions like, what? How is that possible? It's like, it's not that hard to figure out. You know, we know something about endocrinology. And and the cis female took hormones and actually chest fed the kids. So there was so many cool things going on. It was such a beautiful lesson of, you know, transformation. But they were also like, they're getting through the pregnancy and they want to be role models because their story is fantastic, but they're also just getting ready for a baby.
Yeah, they're new parents. Yeah.
So what they did is they set up like a little like a website with like an FAQ. And
That's
they were
what I did for my life.
like things you're allowed to ask, things we'd prefer you not ask, and with a little Google search, just leave us out of that. And it was fantastic because every time people asked, they were like, we're so glad you're interested. We actually have done our best to answer all those questions once. We gave it that. Please, we tried to make it easy for you to get all those answers. We want to be representative of diversity, but we also need to live our lives, you know? And I remember having a wonderful time, and I almost felt really overjoyed to be learning the answers to my questions. Like, hey, when did you decide? And like, when? Like, oh, and does, you know, how are the parents about it? And to be able to enjoy the answers to that question, knowing that I wasn't burdening them, because I was curious and I learned a lot, and I was able to gain that knowledge without burdening them. Now, of course, they had to initially put these stuff out there, but I remember thinking, wow, what a great model, that there's a way to do it. That, you know, we're all struggling to figure out. We want to represent, we also want to live our lives and have the energy to go on.
I'm curious. Well, not really curious. I know the answer to this, but Leo, going back to what you were saying about the department and stuff and communication, we all talked about in our class how apparently the female faculty don't make as much as the men, and that I think is inexcusable, especially since you were so qualified. And minority people are overqualified, and women especially. I read the statistic recently that white men especially, will apply for a job they're only 40% qualified for, whereas minority candidates will wait till they are overqualified or like twice that. I think that's just just the system of oppression that we live in. But also, like, I just wanted to let you know, I put that thing on the what do you call it, on the SRI. I was like, the women of the department deserve a raise, because you do, like you do so much more than some of the male faculty. Like you two were saying about like mentoring students in private. Like, there's certain things that I would not go to other professors for. You know what I mean? Not because you're a woman, but because I trust you. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I think that's really important to note. And academic institutions shouldn't just like blindly sign a check for someone who may look more qualified but isn't doing as much work.
And you know, that's only going to get worse because we know that after the pandemic, there is a slow rolling mental health tsunami.
Yeah. I've
that
considered dropping out of school and I'm almost done.
That has affected marginalized individuals the worst. And it's not just the folks who are about to go to college. My sister teaches second graders in Southern California. And the transformation of the pandemic and the losses in learning, socialization, dislocation, families moving, chaos in the household. She says, we're all a bit traumatized from seeing for the first time what's happening in our kids' homes, those deficits. And I said to her, I said, well, those are going to be my students in 10 years. What are we going to do? So if universities don't figure out which faculty are able to speak to folks who have had trauma, to folks who have been left out, if they don't figure out how to value appropriately the work of those individuals, then their university is not going to be able to function, because people can't learn if they don't feel safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. And, Sky, I think about the classes we've had together and the interactions we've had with students, and how I feel like we all went through great pains to cultivate a space where we could feel safe, right?
Especially in our health comm class, with the vaccination status. Yeah, that was insanity.
Yeah, it was, right? And I'm going to be honest. So for our listeners and our viewers, last semester we had a senior level advanced health communication class where there were only 5 students enrolled after like fluctuating enrollment and whatnot. And there were 5 men, and then me, a cisgender, queer, brown girl as a faculty member. And I remember thinking this could either go really, really well or not well at all. And thankfully, it went really well. And we had good, respectful, hard conversations together. And we learned a lot from and with each other. But it is an extra labor of love that goes into it, right? And this also goes back to your point, Sky, about mentoring, right? Like I mentioned earlier, we mentor because we love it. We love you all. Working with you all brings us joy. It's literally the best part of our day. But also, as Lisa noted, it's oftentimes labor that is not recognized by the institution, that is disproportionately done by women of color, and queer individuals. And it's our identities that bring us together, right? We feel safety and security in most instances with individuals like ourselves. And going back to your point about the pay equity, it wasn't just pay inequity with women and men in the department. There were also a few women in the department who were getting paid more than other women. So intersectionally, there were all kinds of power imbalances there. And I remember when we first found out about it, and I had just started my position at the institution 2 weeks in, and I found out about this. And my dad said, if you complain about this, you are going to be labeled as the angry brown girl, and then they are going to reprimand you. So you need to tread carefully.
Yeah, my mom always talks about being the crazy person at the counter. Yeah,
exactly.
It's a stereotype we all have to fight as marginalized people. I think if a white man were to do that, it would be fine. But I don't know.
Absolutely. So I said, you know what, Dad, I'm too old to care. I'm going in. We're burning it down, right? And after 2 years, pay equity was finally reached for all of the individuals in our department. But that was 2 years of extra labor and work and report writing and data gathering, and then the actual stresses of going through the conversation. All of these parts of the puzzle that we don't ever talk about from an uncompensated labor perspective.
Yeah. And also, it's like the thing that I feel like I don't know how to even explain to some of my colleagues is, they'll be like, well, you don't have to, respond. You don't have to have a meeting with all those students who want to meet with you. And I'm saying to them, okay, often the students who want to meet with you are interested in a letter of recommendation. The students who would like to meet with me and want me to put my evening on hold to Zoom with them are suicidal. Like, you cannot compare to me. You cannot tell me, well, yes, you've been doing extra service, but that was your choice. You have a choice. When you have a student whose life is at stake, that's, and that it's like, I'm not gonna do the injustice of trying to put a dollar figure and say that but the inability to recognize that the type of service that marginalized individuals do is
Yeah.
not the kind of stuff that we can say, oh, I don't have time for that. There are bodies on the line. And
Especially with the pandemic, yeah.
Yeah, it's just
and
as much survival for our students as it is for us, right? Like
Yeah.
we need these relationships too, and we benefit from them. And the asinine assumption that we should put a dollar amount on it or an hour limit time frame on it, right? Like, really?
Sometimes you just got like, I don't know, like I think we're especially in this time where people just have to do what's or should do what's right instead of what's easy. Do you know what I mean? To
Mhm.
quote Harry Potter again, you know what I mean? Like,
It's true. And
I
it's
think
hard.
we're at this point, yeah.
I think a lot of individuals with privilege have to
Mhm.
realize that it's not a matter of actually just adding something. You have to be willing to put something of yourself on the line and actually sacrifice something. And, you
To be
know,
emotionally vulnerable with someone, yeah.
yeah. And I think that's, if I look at my own life, I think when I was younger, it was hard for me to understand the depth of that and what that really meant. It's taken me some years and some maturity. So I understand that it can be still a hard message to convey. So I get that from the inside, but I just have to hope that with each generation, maybe we get that message through a little bit faster, a little bit more efficiently to get to the point of progress a little bit faster. Maybe we'll always be, there's friction. Let's just get a little bit faster.
So I have all kinds of thoughts, Guy.
Mhm.
So not only was I born and raised in Texas, which is making all kinds of headlines right now because of
Yeah, yeah.
problematic anti-abortion legislation, anti-trans legislation, and on and on and on. But I was also
Mhm.
born and raised in a traditional Mexican Catholic household. I went to a
Mhm.
Catholic all-girls school, a Catholic undergraduate institution. It is the name of my game until my partner and I were like, we're not getting married in the Catholic Church. And then everyone in the family was like, I'm sorry, what? And you don't want kids intentionally? I'm sorry, what? So here we are several years later. But the reason I bring that up as a piece of context is because what we're ultimately talking about here are competing discourses or competing dialogues and
Mhm.
conversations, right? When we're thinking about pro-life or anti-abortion and pro-choice, whether we're thinking about my ability to practice my religion or not practice a religion at all versus someone else's. And if we look at the history of anti-abortion legislation and radicalism and clinic bombing and things of that nature, it is intimately tied to, no surprise here, Christianity, right? So when we think about how the very history of our country is intimately intertwined with Christianity and American nationalism and everything else, then we can see how we've come this far over the past several decades. I remember when I was younger, one of the activist frameworks that helped me make sense of all of this was reproductive justice, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
Sky,
Yeah,
we've
yeah.
talked about this a ton in so many other spaces and contexts, but for those of you who are listening who haven't heard of it, reproductive justice as a framework, a movement, a set of ideologies and practices helps us move past the pro-life, anti-abortion, pro-choice binary, right? To really think
Mhm.
about reproductive health, access, and justice across the lifespan. And it's not just for cisgender women either, right? Several of our foundational reproductive justice activists and mothers were Black women, right? And we need to acknowledge that it is a movement originally created by Black women for Black women because of the racism that was experienced in pro-choice feminist circles historically, right? So if we're thinking
Mhm.
about Women's History Month and which voices and histories are talked about, the reproductive justice one, and I've studied this in news spaces, it does not get the same amount of airwaves or coverage
Yeah.
the way pro-life, anti-abortion, pro-choice discourses do.
And it's because it's a deeper critique, because it's not just pro choice. It's like, what is this system through which your ability to control your body depends on your race and your class. Like, wait a second, there's more going on here than meets
It's like intersectional
It is.
justice.
It's intersectionality in a nutshell, my friends. Like the reproductive justice activists historically not only critiqued racism and exclusionary practices in the feminist movement and the women's movement, they also were saying it's not just about abortion. We need maternal health care, prenatal care, postnatal care. We need better family leave policies for all parents of all gender identities. And reproductive justice makes a very intentional effort and provides a very intentional space for queer, BIPOC, trans bodies to also get the very real healthcare access and needs and support that they need too. It kind of like really turns the whole pro-life, pro-choice binary on its head, right? Because it enlarges it full fold.
I mean, because it really goes to the heart of who is even allowed to make certain decisions, who is even allowed to to even articulate something as a choice.
Yeah, my sister always says, like, no uterus, no opinion. And I'm like, honestly, kind of.
And, you know, my sense is that, Sky, it's interesting because, you know, the outrage that you were expressing, you know, it is amazing how little has changed in the, you know, I first became an activist around reproductive justice in the mid 1990s.
Okay, before I was born.
Clinic defense and getting women in and out, and
oh wow,
the amount
cool.
the amount that has not changed. Like literally, you could have just pressed pause, and I never would have thought that we would be where we are now. I was sure that we were on the right track. And for a while, it seemed like we were. Pro-choice became kind of mainstream.
Yeah.
Then all this stuff about late-term abortions and, you know, and like all these side paths back into control and oppression. And it's literally all the same people who are trying to keep trans youth from medical care. It's the same people, it's the same fight. It's never changed. They do not want certain people to have control over their bodies.
Who are your guys' personal heroes that are women?
I came up with one, a Utah specific one that I only found out about recently. Hold on, I put it on my website. It was okay. Judy, remind me okay, I see her. Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, the first female state senator in Utah. And she was a doctor when no one was allowed to.
First head of the health department.
Pardon?
Also first head of the health department.
First head of the health department.
Okay. That's awesome.
Quite, and I've heard about her on I saw there was a documentary about her, and just one of those you know, and she was a polygamous wife. She was married to a polygamist, so very interesting background, but someone who became a physician at a time when women becoming physicians was not a thing. And she just barreled forward and was an incredible figure here, and that was a big supporter of equal voting rights. And I think is a great example of someone whose biographical history, you know, they've got the polygamy, they've got this, that, and you're like, wow, progress comes from strange places. And let us all just decide that we want progress. Like, whoever you are, if you're going in the right direction, come on, let's do it.
Jump on the bandwagon, basically, yeah.
I love that. Wow. I did not know about this individual. Now I'm going to spend some time researching them later. I love that. Mine is not specific to Utah at all. It's actually my grandma. And Sky, we might have talked about her at some point in the past. But I didn't have to look too far when I was younger to see what it meant to be a powerful woman, not only ancestrally, but also like in that moment. So I mentioned earlier that my family was from the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas. And when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848 and the American Southwest became America when it used to be Mexican land, right? That's when my family essentially became American citizens. And they always used to tell me stories of how my great, great, great grandmas would fight against the colonizers to keep their land, how they'd go out on their horses with all their guns, and how like this kind of spirit was really embedded in me from a young age. So my grandma lived with us my entire life, which was one of the greatest blessings of my life because I got to see her every day. And my grandma was a single mother of 13 children. So let me explain this. She had 8 children biologically and then 5 stepchildren from her second marriage. They were my step grandpa's kids from his previous marriage that she still treated like her own. She was a survivor of intimate partner domestic violence. And when she had had enough of it with both my grandpa and then her second marriage, she divorced both of them and was a single mother, raising all of them while working multiple jobs without a degree and on, right? It's very much a kind of story that I think many women of color are accustomed to growing up with and having heard. But she had this attitude and spirit about her that was always about not just doing things for yourself, but about giving back to the community as well. And I'm over here thinking, like, how could she think that or be like that when she was constantly exhausted, constantly working, constantly trying to do what she could to provide for all of the children? But then it clicked to me that the spirit of giving back was really kind of what gave her the power to keep going every day. So I remember when I was younger, my grandma and my mom would both tell me, like, you getting a PhD is not for yourself. It is for you to give back to your students and to your community and to make the world a better place for everyone involved. And this is also going back to the point I made earlier about mentorship and community activism, right? Like, this is I think, the heartbeat of so much of our work. And when things get tiring, because they do, my friends, that's always kind of the number one theme that brings me back to it and recenters me, right? Like, we're making the world a better place in the midst of all the shenanigans we're seeing now, right? And by working together, hopefully we'll make the world a little brighter. Like, that's what I tell myself when I'm ready to set everything on fire.
Yeah, I think my personal hero is probably my twin sister or my grandma, my great grandma. I don't really know her very well, but it's definitely my sister, but like also there's like this rich history of the women in my family being educated and doing all this crazy stuff. Um, my great grandmother on my dad's side, my dad's mom's mom, she translated the entirety of the Talmud and the Torah into Farsi so that the women of the congregation could like read and have something to teach their children with. Do you know what I mean? That's pretty
Whoa.
cool. Like, I'm Jewish by yeah, and that was something that's really cool. We still have a copy of her Siddur, so that's pretty cool in our house. But yeah, that's something that I can tie my name to and say like, hey, like that's someone who I was related to, you know, and that's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah,
That
and
is pretty cool.
she was a relatively religious, pretty religious Jew in a household of very secular Jews. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something I really admired about her too. She was very devout, and my dad tells stories about how he would like turn off the lights and she'd have to go turn them back on because before timers existed or whatever, and like to prank her or whatever. But she was so steadfast in her beliefs that she was willing to do something that was against, like not against, but like that was different than her husband and her grandchildren. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like she was more devout, and that's something I draw inspiration from as a practicing Jew. As the one practicing Jew in my entire family, you know. So yeah, yeah,
Well, and I think it just shows that it is not the, strictness of a tradition that you follow or the throwing off of the strictures. It's the ability and the autonomy to make a choice.
I totally agree. I 100% agree with you. I got into an argument with one of my relatives about like whether or not like people like there's a lot of Islamophobia within the Jewish faith and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I think less so in this generation, but I was having a conversation with my uncle about this, but actually I won't say his name. I was having a conversation with a family member about this, and we were talking about how some people who are feminists, and rightfully so, feminism is about the right to choose. Like there are feminist women who feel like wearing a hijab makes them feel more in contact with Allah or God. And I think that's perfectly normal, fine, whatever. Like everyone's entitled to their own choice. She can still be a feminist just because she quote unquote wears something that has been used to oppress people. That's not what it is about. Especially in Afghanistan. Sorry, I pronounce things in the Farsi way, but in Afghanistan with the whole withdrawing of troops and support in the Taliban, the thing is, it doesn't like it's not like an evil thing to want to wear a hijab if you feel like it makes you closer to God. It's about what you want to do. It's about your choice in the matter.
Yeah.
And well, it's very white Western standards imposed upon a different cultural group, right? Which is problematic.
Yeah, I think people see covering themselves up as something that's Eastern, and there's a lot of ethnocentrism in that. Like people are like, why would you do that? Like my God doesn't make me cover up, but he does in a different way. You know what I mean? Like I think like it's all the same God in my opinion. Do you know what I mean? But like we just choose, like I think just in general, like I think that like God, I'm not incredibly religious, but I think that God is a merciful person, or deity, whatever. And I think that like when humanity tries to interpret the books or whatever, I think that's when it gets muddled. It's like a game of telephone. Like one person has received the information from God, but then it goes downward, and like it's like a game of telephone. You know what I
It's
mean? Like
interesting.
not everyone
I
knows.
was
Yeah.
actually just thinking about that metaphor, the game of telephone, like a day or so ago, and I was like, why didn't anybody ever look at like the books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and be like, wait a second, this is just one big game of telephone. Like,
Yeah,
I
right?
heard that
Yeah.
Jesus, I heard that he did this. Well, I said it. I'm like, wait, you told who? And you told her? Oh, wait. Oh, but no wonder we have 4 books. It's just a long game of
Yeah,
telephone.
same thing in Judaism. Like the only thing we are taught as Reformed Jews that came from God, or just in general that came from God, is the Torah. You know what I mean? Like the Ten Commandments and the Torah, right? But then there's this whole study of Jewish law, the Talmud, that is based on that. But like you're not supposed to eat pork because your body's holy, right? So like that's not what God said. That's the game of telephone. Do you know what I mean? In my opinion, at least. Do you know what I mean? Like that's literally interpreting
And I guess,
something from somebody who didn't even have the direct passage. Do you know what I
and
mean?
to some
Like,
degree, it's kind of reassuring to know that like humans
yeah,
have been doing this forever. Like
yeah,
humans
yeah,
have been doing this forever. We are not living through anything unique. We just have to understand that humans tend to make the same mistakes over and over again.
a
And
100%.
probably the central mistake is thinking that what's best for me is going to be what's best for you. And like it all comes down to that. Like if we could
Yeah,
just figure that out, like go ahead, you do you.
yeah.
I'm going to do me.
Yeah, from an interfaith perspective, I was actually involved in the interfaith council at UVU. We talked about these guardrails that we had, and we're not treating people like we want to be treated. We're treating them how they want to be treated. That's something that we should teach in school, not like,
Yeah.
oh, the golden rule. No, like how I want to be treated could be different than somebody else. You know what I mean? Like it just is what it is.
Yeah.
So do you guys have any last thoughts or want to answer anything I didn't ask you, or like things you want to plug?
I do have a shameless plug for any of our viewers or listeners who are in the Salt Lake area, broadly defined. I'm a co-organizer for the Salt Lake area queer climbing organization. We have weekly climbing meetups. We also have outdoor hiking events. We have programs in place to help mitigate access issues to gear, the great outdoors. So yeah, if you are interested in hiking, rock climbing, and even if you have zero experience with any of that, it doesn't matter. Look us up on Instagram. We are SLAQ Climbers. Our acronym is SLAQ, SLAQC. And yeah, we would love to see you at some of our events. It really has been my queer home away from home here in Salt Lake
Yeah,
City.
yeah.
And at our very first event, which was our Pride Month event last summer, we had almost 70 queer climbers from the community of all. Yeah, so many of us.
I'll have to make the trip out once I'm in a little better shape and not so asthmatic. But
not so asthmatic. I would love for you and everyone else to come join. We also have shared meetups with Color the Wasatch, which is our sibling BIPOC climbing group. So in the spirit of intersectionality, we oftentimes join forces for mutual gear aid and just a good time. So it's a home away from home for all of our queer and BIPOC community members.
And I am doing a lot of work right now trying to understand what it means to feel safe, and where individuals with different forms of marginalization, what is it to feel safe? What are the cues of safety that we need in our everyday life to allow us to turn off that buzz of uncertainty and wariness and fully engage with the moment? And I feel like safety is one of those things we all kind of know what we mean when we talk about it, but I'm trying to find a way to capture it, to measure it, to find a way to identify where it's lacking and how we can increase it. And so I'm going to be doing a lot of projects this summer trying to unpack this notion of social safety and where queer people experience it. So if you are interested in those topics, just look up Lisa Diamond, University of Utah, and send me an email.
Very cool.
We're actually doing, do you want to plug the study we're doing, Leah?
Oh, yeah. So hopefully, if all of the funding works out well, Sky is going to be one of our research assistants, where we are going to look at menstruation experiences and menstruation / justice on college campuses. So
yeah, there's a couple people around UVU who are like talking to me about like getting free access to like sanitation supplies for menstruation, and I was like, that's actually a great idea. Like, I wasn't in positions of like authority or whatever, so I was like, I will pass that along, you know?
yeah, and how menstruation necessities should be in all restrooms, right? For all individuals.
Somebody who goes into the men's restroom, it's a little hard sometimes, you know?
It's amazing to me whenever I go through airports and I see that they have like a sharps container. I'm like, great, you're doing a great job with diabetics. How about half of the uteruses on the planet? You know, it's like,
right? Yeah. Thank you guys again for letting me be a part of this. Your token trans man of the chat, but it was really great.
Fantastic. This was so much fun.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, I look forward to talking to you both again, hopefully soon. But yeah.
Thanks, both of you.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Thank you.